Ladies and gentlemen, we must invest today to save tomorrow.
In the southern tip of Ethiopia, the people of Borena say Boni, Nyapa, Ganaman, Felli, which directly translated to drought or climate crisis is the enemy. So take care and use early warning.
Talks at the COP29 climate summit in Azerbaijan are on the verge of collapse after poor countries walked out of the meeting saying their financial needs are being ignored. Negotiations were deadlocked over how much money richer nations should provide to poorer ones.
When we talk about climate justice, when we talk about climate risks and actions globally and at every level, climate finance is at the center of every discussion and every intervention. Conference of Parties negotiation, which has been taking place for the last 20 plus years, also has been focusing on climate finance, but still the very sad part is that the issue of climate finance is not going at the expected pace in order to address the impacts of climate change, which has been said for several years.
From parched lands of Borena to the landslide-prone regions of Gofa, communities across the country are bearing the burdens of climate-induced disaster. To secure a sustainable future, Ethiopia requires substantial climate finance to adapt to the changing climate and build resilience.
The communities at the front line of these impacts are the rural and the poor communities in the different parts of the country. The Borena disaster is one of the most shocking that has really impacted the community, but we can also mention other climate impacts that happen in the form of flooding, which we also witnessed even in last year.
The pastoralists of Ethiopia are really the most vulnerable group for a climate change. In Borena, the recurrence of drought is become repeatedly. More than 90% of the people are pastoralists, so they rely heavily on their own livestock for the human consumption, for everything.
They contributed almost none to the impact that they are facing, but unfortunately, the adaptive capacity of these rural communities is also very limited or minimal. In some cases, almost not there, because adaptive capacity requires, on the first place, finance should be there.
As the world grapples with escalating climate crisis, the urgent need for substantial climate finance has never been more apparent. Ethiopia, a nation poised on the brink of significant economic growth, stands vulnerable to the impact of climate change.
The adaptive capacity can be explained in different terms, but at the end of the day, it is almost about finance in order to improve the livelihood of the community and also build their community. And from our understanding, also from our intervention, the issue of climate finance, there is no clear way you can track whether the climate finance that is coming to the country is really being trickled down to the local community.
Climate finance is a perfect reflection of the ailing global order. So when the 100 billion per year target was decided, and then it was supposedly made in 2022, 2 years after the target, we contest that that was made. It was hugely discredited, actually, because we found that many of them come in loans, adding on debt. We also found that anything goes, that there are investigations that show that chocolate factories are even counted as climate finance. For Ethiopia, for instance, if you look at the data from 2022, from OECD countries are saying that Ethiopia got the biggest grant for climate change. And then when you cross-check that with the Ethiopian government, actually what they tell you is that whatever came, it was to support Ethiopia to recover from post-war, post-conflict. So whatever is coming as, as recovery is counted as climate change. You will see that support that comes for poverty reduction, for instance, it is being counted as climate change. What this shows you is that we're not talking about new and additional money. In fact, we are talking about repurposing of money to climate change. There is wrong tagging of resources flowing to the countries as climate finance. Now, when you do not have accountability, transparency in the last 100 billion per annum target, what makes you think that it will be now?
However, accessing and utilizing these funds remains a significant challenge as a complex international agreement and bureaucratic hurdles often hinder their flow to the most vulnerable countries.
Most CSOs do not know where to access that climate finance itself because there is no mechanism, there is no architecture that can clearly tell you the presence of climate finance to be tapped first by CSOs, and then even to go to the competition itself, you have to have good information. Therefore, the first thing that I think should be done is there should be clear climate finance communication that is available in the country itself.
So I think the biggest gap in the youth being meaningfully engaged in the climate finance or any other topics around climate is that there is a huge gap in capacity and knowledge and access to those critical conversations being held within the national as well as the global levels. And I do see a growing movement around including more youth in those conversations, but still when it comes to countries like Ethiopia, the youth barely has an understanding of what are these processes, how does that affect my my daily life and my future as well. And so I think they are critical stakeholders but have been for the most part left out of the conversation. So the biggest gap is that lack of engagement with the youth, and then also capacitating them with the right tools and knowledge to be able to meaningfully engage in those conversations.
It is unfair to ask countries like Ethiopia, for instance, to borrow because that is what the new collective quantified goal is telling you, that they are going to consider grants and highly concessional loans. Whether you call it concessional, highly concessional, you are going to pay back, okay, the creditors. That is number one. So the question as an Ethiopian, as Africans, we should ask is that why should Ethiopia borrow for droughts in Borena, in Gofa, for example, And you notice that we are alternating between extreme weather events where you have drought now and then there is flooding. So why should countries like Ethiopia, who have no historical responsibilities, be borrowing from creditors? So that is number one. Number two, I insist that such kind of mechanism and arrangement is like you are borrowing from the arsonist. Someone comes and lights your house and then they tell you, here is money, build back, but you will pay me back, and that's exactly what the landscape is showing you. Ethiopia is a least developed country. It's in that category. Although vulnerability should be the determining factor even for other African countries that we claim to be developing countries. That being said, Ethiopia's interest would be how does Ethiopia access technology? How does Ethiopia access finances, which we call means of implementation, for instance? So when it comes to finances, is it easy to access? It should be easier for countries like Ethiopia. It should be predictable. It should be certain. It should also be on grant basis and not loans, whether concessional or non-concessional.
By defining a clear framework for the climate finance and ensuring transparency and accountability, Ethiopia can harness the power of these funds to safeguard its future.
The role of Ethiopia should be on meaningful reforms, not superficial reforms. Okay? How do we do that? When we talk about, as I said earlier, when we talk about reforms, it's usually band-aid, because I don't see any incentive for reforms, you know. If there is any reform, then it is likely to be superficial. Let me elaborate. In the past, in the 1980s, for instance, we had structural adjustment programs, and that was just a policy experimentation on developing countries. So we are a field of policy experimentation. So of course there is no single way or approach of, for instance, you know, how do you reform? That is one. But the other is an overhaul of the system. How do you come with new institutions that are inclusive, but also that are equitable in their governance, in their mobilization of resources, in the access of it, in technological transform, and so on. So are we going to approach it from a reform point of view or having new institutions?
It should empower the local community. By what? Involving them in the decision making to ensure the fund should reach to the grassroots level.
The other thing is Ethiopia. I mean, Addis Ababa is the capital city of Ethiopia, but it's also the capital city of the African Union, because the African Union is headquartered here. So how does Ethiopia leverage on this? So one would be to push for Africa to be a unified bloc, just like the European Union. In every COP, for instance, you'll find the European Union negotiating as a bloc, because it is party to the convention. It is party to the Paris Agreement. Africa is not.
We CSOs ourselves should be responsible for building our capacity itself. We shouldn't look for someone from the outside in the camp and build our capacity. Therefore, we have to use every possible option to build our capacity. And the capacity building doesn't come, you know, by simply by talking, and we have to widen our network with national and as well as regional and international networks. And one way is that in terms of climate finance, we have to be able to build our capacity, as I said. And the other one is we should be able to positively engage with the government, so that any finance that comes to the country should be available to all stakeholders, not only through the government channels, because there are options in some countries where CSOs also benefit from the climate finance that comes through the climate through the government channel. This is another way. The other one is linking ourselves also with regional and global alliances that can give us more chance to network, and also to make our voice part of the global and international voice, to advocate for climate finance and to make accountable the developed countries that they should put enough money to the climate finance. We should also be part of this global advocacy on climate finance, or being voice of the voiceless communities that we talked at the beginning.
Yet, amidst this challenge, a glimmer of hope emerges. Ethiopian youth, along with local communities and NGOs, are at the forefront of the climate action, demanding accountability and driving change.
I think having that collaboration with youth that are in the rural areas that are outside of Addis Ababa, to understand what are their challenges in that are caused by climate change, but then also how are we able to kind of collaborate in learning more about what are their challenges and how do we support each other in learning more about these impacts that is causing on vulnerable communities.
ActionAid, through their different projects as well as global platform, is also one of the leading voices in the climate action through their community outreach and impactful initiatives, engaging youth and adults alike. Their commitment to addressing climate change includes participation in campaigns, influencer training, and reforestation efforts, emphasizing the urgent need for climate resilience and mitigation.
Those youths in those areas have the lived experiences of what it means to experienced the impact of climate change firsthand. So I think instead of expecting them to like come forward and like engage in those conversations, I think we should be aiming more for like having like to reach out to them and like going in those places, remote areas, to see what are the experiences that the people are facing, those vulnerable communities, including youth, women, and other communities. And so I think we need to do more in like getting like actually going to those places and like engaging more in person.
Those global leaders from the global south or from the global north should ensure that the climate finance is accessible, effective, and directed toward the adaptation, the resilience building, and the loss and the damage. So the time of act is now. The cost of inaction will be far greater for those communities and the world.
It's time to turn promises into action, secure a sustainable future for Ethiopia and the world.